Go ahead.
This is our curriculum plan for 6th through 8th grade. We will begin by looking at 6th grade.
6th grade. The first quarter for 6th grade focuses on the number system. The objectives include the division of fractions, the relationships between graphs, linear expressions, and independent and dependent variables. The content includes expressions and equations as well as geometry. During the first activity, the students will use expressions and equations when trying to figure out the different ways to make sure every part of the cake equals a whole number 1. When setting up the equation, they will need to make sure that the side dealing with all of the fractions from each piece of the cake is equivalent or equal to 1. In the second activity, the students will have to make sure that their equations line up and stay true to their graphs. For geometry, the students focus on the geometry of shapes and dividing the whole cake into different fractions. In the second activity, geometry is incorporated because with every different equation, the graph produces a different shape that the students can make connections between the characteristics of the equations and the characteristics of the graph. During the second quarter, for 6th grade, the focus is on ratios and proportions. The objectives include identifying equivalent ratios to create scale drawings and transforming measurement units using proportional reasoning, as well as finding equivalent ratios. During one activity, the students will measure their own body measurements and select a dinosaur to make a scale drawing of their own body measurements as well as the dinosaur's body measurements. The students will then compare their own body measurements to that of the dinosaur and create ratios and proportions.
In the third quarter, the focus is on statistics and probability, and in the 6th grade, they mainly focus on analyzing the statistical data. And the objectives are: students will be able to make a histogram based on the data that they have collected from their classmates, and students will be able to draw conclusions and calculate quantitative measures from the histogram, such as mean and median. And other content that is addressed in this quarter are ratios and proportions in the number system. They use ratios and proportions when analyzing the graphs, and they use the number system when they're calculating ratios and proportions and when they are gathering their data.
The fourth quarter focus is geometry. The objectives are: the students will calculate surface area given height, length, and width, and students will be able to find volume using unit cubes. Other content covered is expressions and equations and ratios and proportions. Expressions and equations is covered by students using equations to find area and volume, and ratio and proportions is covered because students find the area of the smaller building and use a proportion to find the area of larger buildings.
Seventh grade. The first quarter focus is expressions and equations. The objectives include scatter plot, creating equations, positive and negative numbers, as well as rational numbers. Other content includes statistics and probability, as well as the number system.
One of our activities focuses on the number line and taking rational numbers and subtracting and adding them using negative and positive numbers, but we use batteries for that to show the examples.
In 7th grade, the second quarter focus is ratios and proportions. The objectives include computing unit rates, determining quantities in a proportional relationship, finding measurements using equivalent ratios, and creating proportional relationships between two quantities. The other standards addressed are measurement and data analysis and geometry. In the first activity, students receive 2 different mixtures of cherry syrup and soda, and they have to make them equivalent. And in the second activity, students will use measurements of ratios and proportions to find which giant left the handprints and footprints in their classroom.
For the third quarter, the focus is on statistics and probability, and the objectives are students will be able to conduct experiments and collect multiple same-size samples to compare and contrast. And students will be able to compare the 4 sample data with each other by using percentages, ratios, and fractions. And the other content areas that are addressed are numbers and operations, and ratios and proportions. In the activities, numbers and operations are used when they spin the spinner and create the 4 sample sizes. And ratios and proportions are used when they compare the 4 sample sizes to each other.
The fourth quarter focus is geometry. The objectives for geometry are students will be able to draw shapes freehand with a ruler and with technology when given certain conditions. Students will be able to draw and describe 3D shapes, and students will be able to determine the 2D pictures that result from slicing 3D figures. Other content covered in the fourth quarter includes expressions and equations and ratios and proportions.
We will now move on to the 8th grade. The first quarter's focus is on expressions and equations. The objectives include irrational and rational numbers, expanded forms, modular arithmetic, and solving multi-step problems. Other content includes the number system and geometry.
For one of the activities for 8th grade, we are doing an activity with fractions where the students are bakers and they have to cut a normal size cake into 4 sections, and then each of those sections must be cut into different fraction sizes, and then the students will have to figure out how to make all of the 4 sides that they cut into separate fractions equal to the whole number 1.
In the second quarter, the focus is functions. The objectives are creating tables of data values, demonstrating that each input generates a pattern of output, defining and recognizing a linear function, constructing a graph of a function based on data collected, determining independent and dependent variables, and describing the relationship between 2 quantities by seeing the graph of their linear functions. The other content standards reviewed are expressions and equations, as well as statistics and probability. In the first activity, students will be given manila envelopes, scales, and pieces of paper. They will determine the weight of the manila envelope after each paper is added and how much it will cost to mail it. They will then predict the amount it will cost after they add 15 more sheets of paper, 30 more sheets of paper, and so on. In the second activity, students will set dollar amounts for Mythical Walkathon fundraisers. Then they will receive sponsor information and determine how much they will need to raise in order to meet their goal from each sponsor. They will graph for both of these, which will accomplish the functions and graphing functions of linear equations. Expressions and equations will be found when they are solving linear functions, and statistics and probability will be found in when they collect data or are given data.
In the third quarter, the focus is on statistics and probability, and the objectives include students will be able to construct scatter plots of data with 2 variables, students will be able to interpret individual data points to make conclusions about the data, students will be able to write equations for best fit lines, students will be able to gather data and then graph the data they have collected, and students will be able to determine which of the sets of data are closest and farthest to linear, and students will be able to calculate correlation coefficients. And the other content areas that are addressed are expressions and equations and ratios and proportions, and those are used in the activities because when they make the scatter plot and they have the best fit line, they have to use equations to find the lines after that, and then for ratios and proportions, they are comparing the data.
The fourth quarter focus is geometry. The standards for this quarter are students will be able to find missing sides of a right triangle using the Pythagorean theorem, make their own problems using the Pythagorean theorem, find measures of angles in a triangle and know that they add up to 180 degrees, determine exterior angles of a triangle, and find measurements and relationships between angles made by two parallel lines cut by a transversal. The other content explored in this quarter is expressions and equations and proportions.
For our curriculum plan, we did demonstrations all from 7th grade, which are the 7th grade first quarter Power Up for modeling, 7th grade second quarter Cherry Syrup for investigation, and 7th grade first semester stock market for semester long plan. It's the modeling activity called Power Up, which to start off you draw a number line like this from 6 to -5, and after our number line is drawn we have two batteries to show the rational number 6, and we're going to place that on the number line, and the other rational number -4, which is here, and we're going to show the equation 6 plus -4. So we're going to take -4 and put it here and draw out a line that goes from 6 4 ways. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and that'll show -4 because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, -4. So 6 plus -4 equals 2. And this represents adding and subtracting of rational numbers on a number line and using the different charges and batteries to show that as well.
In this investigation activity, the students will receive 2 cups, each with a different mixture of clear soda to cherry syrup. They will then have to use tables of equivalent ratios to make the mixtures equal of soda to cherry syrup. In our semester-long project for expressions and equations and ratios and proportions, the students will be doing a stock market project. They will get into groups of 3 or 4 and receive an imaginary budget of $1,000. From this budget, they will research the stock market and determine where they would like to allocate their money into which stocks. They will track their stocks for 2 weeks, looking at the percent increase and decrease and determine how much money is gained or lost each day. After the end of the 2 weeks, they will create a stock portfolio and determine how much money they would have gained or lost if they were to sell at the end of the 2 weeks.
We will now move on to the standards of mathematical practice. During our curriculum plan, the students use the following standards: make sense of problems and persevere in solving them, reason abstractly and quantitatively, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, model with mathematics, use appropriate tools strategically, attend to precision, look for and make use of structure, and look for and express regularity and repeated reasoning.
These are shown through many of our mini lessons and semester-long projects, especially construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, because for many of the projects, the students were put into groups, and for the justification of them, they had to argue for the case to figure out which method is correct to finding the right solution, as well as model with mathematics. The students were given many different opportunities in the mini activities to not only learn the mathematical practice of it, but also to see a model example so they can have a hands-on experience with the actual mathematical practice as well. This is shown in our Power Up activity, which was just a demonstration, where the students put the different charges on the batteries on the number line to represent the different equations, as well as the cherry syrup activity, where the students were filling up each cups to figure out how to make the 2 cups equivalent.
We will conclude with the 5 NCTM process standards. They include problem solving, reasoning and proof, communication, connections, and representation.
For problem solving, our activities in the semester projects deal with problem solving for middle school students because they require students to use a variety of approaches and strategies in order to find the solutions for a problem. An example of this would be in the 8th graders having to go around the city and finding distances for various buildings. The students then will have to come up with the Pythagorean theorem equations for it, as well as graph and various equations, which are things that they previously learned throughout the 3rd and 4th quarters as well as the first semester. For reasoning and proof, for all the assignments, students will have to justify their work that they have provided to either the class or the teacher. The justification of their work is important because it shows that they have a complete understanding of the subject and why they chose the method that is most appropriate. This should be true as well when the students are working in groups by having each student give feedback to each other on assignments that make sure each other are using the correct methods to get the solution. Communication. Throughout the majority of the activities, students are required to work in groups or have class discussions. This requires effective math communication so that the students are able to collaborate with one another and with the class. During the semester-long projects, the students will have to incorporate both foci for the quarters, which will rely heavily on their ability to communicate about the mathematical concepts. Students will also need to use clear and coherent language to organize their thoughts properly in order to make sense to their peers. Connections. Throughout all of our activities that span the 3 grade levels as well as the semester-long projects, we incorporated different math content connections. For every quarter, we incorporated 2 different aspects of mathematics content that was outside of our math focus for that quarter. This is important because involving other foci within a specific math focus can help students to understand the different representations. The NCTM process standard of representation is incorporated in all of our activities and semester-long projects throughout all 3 years. Representation is involved in different ways in all of the activities, such as using batteries and number lines for dealing with rational number equations, creating graphs and tables to show different aspects of mathematics, such as finding the appropriate lines for points, as well as showing gains and losses when dealing with profit. Representation is important for the students because in our project, it is part of the finished project and helps to reinforce the work that they completed for the project.